Hi there. In this session, you are exploring the very definition of global public policy. How do we conceptualize it? What are the key theoretical questions that we're asking about its formulation? And can we develop a critical perspective on the relationship between globalization process and the very local nature of public policy? First of all, obviously, it is important to understand what we mean by these words and concepts. Public policy is a plan of action pursued with pure intention of solving a public problem in a given locality, right? Or for the general public. It is pursued by a government or a local authority in its traditional sense, and it is formed of four stages, as most policies are by their very nature. Stage one is problem definition and agenda setting. Every policy starts with that component. What is it that we're trying to answer, and how are we going to respond this? What are the challenges that we're facing? Second stage is the formal decision-making process. Eventually, those who are in charge of policy making look at the options available to them and reach a conclusion for various reasons and factors that this is the right course of action or desired course of action to pursue, and therefore that's what should happen. And the third stage is policy implementation. That's when a policy is executed and applied and actualized. And the fourth stage of a traditional policy understanding is monitoring and evaluation, right? How do we observe whether our policy is working, and how do we evaluate this outcome? So if you think about public policy analysis from a perspective of these four stages, then it is primarily about understanding how all the stages actualize themselves. Stage one was agenda setting. Why was this agenda chosen? How was it framed? What were the questions being asked? What led to that process within which this challenge became a policy question? And stage two, the decision-making process, which is reflections and analysis on why was this decision made the way that it was made? Who was in the room? Whose interests were heard? Or what led them to decide in a particular way? What was the model they used to evaluate cost and benefit? Or was it an interest, or was it thinking about something else? Was it shaped by an ideology, identity, history? What were the options available to them, or they limited options in a particular way? And stage three, policy implementation. So how did they implement that policy, right? So how did they seek to execute it? Were there fair, or were there things, shortfalls or shortcomings, structures, resources? How did they go about it? How did they communicate it? How did they actualize their ideas? And then stage four, which is monitoring and evaluation, right? How were they monitoring it, evaluating it? How would we evaluate this process? What could be key indicators to use to observe its effectiveness? So public policy analysis, therefore, takes this holistic perspective on a policy developed by a particular government or an authority to solve with the intention of solving a particular public concern. Going through these kind of four traditional stages of shaping of the agenda, decision making, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation, and assessment of its outcomes, right? What did it result to? Where did it take the question or the challenges? Were the consumers of that policy, people affected by that policy, happy with the outcomes, or did it have undesired outcomes to them, or how did they perceive developments? Did they feel hurt, and etc.? So that's our traditional kind of understanding of public policy and stages of it, and what traditional public policy analysis focused on. But globalization aspect of it, and the global concept around it actually adds a whole another layer to it, because while the traditional public policy to this day still is executed within a local context and is shaped by local context, it is imagined and it is developed within a global context, right? None of us are disconnected from these processes. We're all vulnerable to it. And economic development in other parts of the world, or a security development or a war, directly affects our own domestic experiences, energy prices, availability of particular food, political stabilities or instabilities in our own country, in our day-to-day life, opportunities available to us as individuals, as local governments. So we're not able to envision a local policy without reflection on the global context within which a particular state or particular local unit seeks to navigate those challenges faced by their citizens either to protect them or to seek their welfare or benefit or hear their concerns as they're affected by these global challenges. You could see climate change to be, for example, one that really doesn't have a local boundary or doesn't really accept a national unit as such. It affects all of us within the global context. So that's why globalization as a process is one thing that we need to be reflective of when we think about global public policy. Globalization is a process that interconnected our world at multiple levels and layers for the last 50 years, economically, socially, personally, international travel, international communication, international technologies, including possibilities of doing online studies wherever you are based in the world, learning of other languages, personal experiences. It has been regulated in a space of state-to-state conversations, forming international organizations, international treaties, international regulations. But it has also been experienced at the personal level, us traveling around the world, meeting with each other, learning about different cultures and languages, cuisines, different religions, and different ideas that maybe 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, most of us would not be able to experience those, right? International travel was limited to a very select few, exposure to ideas, exposure to even news developments. Now we immediately see what's happening in one part of the world, and immediately think about implications to us, right? Or immediately we all react to it through social media and etc. So globalization has been a process that has been unfolding for the last 50 years in different sectors, in different ways, and connecting our lives a lot more and affecting us individually and as governments and as policymakers a lot more than we often have realized. But that also leads to a lot of questions, right? How does the local relate to the global from a policy perspective? Are local governments always really independent as much as they make it to be? What happens to sovereignty within the picture of international law, international trade regulations, international parameters that regulates this globalized space that we live in, economic terms, but also what states can do, cannot do, should not do, and how do states navigate that space, and how does that relate to very local nitty-gritty local governance questions? And that kind of poses what Roderick mentioned as a globalization paradox, right? So states want to integrate into global economic opportunities. They want to attract direct investment. They want to be present in global arena. They actively push also for regulations that benefit them, protects them, enables their companies to do trade, enables their citizens to explore opportunities and maximize those opportunities that comes with globalization process. But while doing it, they're continually also putting themselves into scrutiny, into a challenge, into legal pressures, into challenges by other states. And in other words, they're also losing their own power, their own sovereignty, their own control over things because they're vulnerable to decisions taken by an international court or a supranational structure like European Union that decides together on regulations which might not be in your interest as a particular European state or a particular region within a state. Yeah, I mean, your critical industries like agriculture might be affected in a certain different way, or you might have a particular concern which doesn't apply to other EU states, like fishery and how you handle resources of the ocean and so on and so forth. And so that creates that kind of contention. You want to be part of the opportunities and regulation that comes with it, but it also poses challenges to you, your sovereignty, and makes you vulnerable to those global shocks and interests by other groups. And ultimately, also, it poses you a social challenge, which is your own citizens now are able to hold you accountable under international law, and they get exposed to other opportunities that are out there, and they organize better, they communicate better, they learn from other trade unions in other parts of the world and other NGOs, and they receive funding from global entities to pursue projects that you might not, as a local government, think about or might actually be challenging it to you. And with this way, your own society is developing, your civil society is emerging, and you're opening the doors for basically a domestic challenge to you as a policymaker. And that process, both of economic global opportunities, accountability, international regulations, doesn't really work for everybody in the same way, right? So traditionally, and in some of the literature that you're reading, you would see an argument of the core and the periphery of globalization, right? Particularly from a more neo-Marxist approach to this conversation, where the Western nations and a small number of it among them reap the benefits of these kind of neo-liberal economic structure globally, use of resources. The poorer countries develop the products, the richer countries consume, and they get the best deal and they travel around the world. Their passports can open the door for everywhere. But somebody from a developing country might not necessarily be able to travel as freely as a European or North American can. So traditionally, there has this been understanding that the world, therefore, the West versus the global South, stands to win or lose differently from this process. But the reality might not be this hierarchical as often been portrayed. It is a lot more messy because even in the United States, even in Europe, even in the United Kingdom, the same globalization process has also created winners and losers. Those economically, educationally, socially are not able to reap the benefits that come from global markets, investments, travel, and global experiences, and changing job pressures, changing industrial pressures. And a lot of people within the West too have also emerged as losers of this process, not just necessarily categorical winners. Perhaps the difference is a bit wide compared to other countries. There's still certain opportunities in basic economic level and social services, but the fragmentation of a globalized world means that the winners and losers perspective isn't really merely about the West versus global South, but different class structures, different education levels, different wealth distribution in different countries working in different way. Some of the wealthiest people today are not necessarily in the West, and some of the biggest opportunities are not. And also that economic integration, industrial development has led, for example, China to go from a poorer nation to a very major global power today, challenging established Western powers. So, in other words, that trajectory is not linear. It hasn't been linear, and globalization has not been a linear project. And as you do your readings, you will come across articles that actually debate that, because traditionally, particularly in 80s, 90s, and or even early 2000s, a lot of the perspective kind of focused on globalization being this inevitable process, which inevitably leads to a final goal, like modernization, industrial revolution. It develops wealth. It eventually brings us to a stage of no borders, global travel, global citizens, this kind of global arena that goes above nation states, that kind of brings this liberal moment to fruition, and so this kind of global community emerges. For the last 10 years, we have seen that fragmentation, with developments in the United States, even with developments within European Union, desire to bring borders back, desire to curb global travel, desire to curb migration, desire to cut down welfare structures in government. You are now witnessing a backlash to some of these ideas, and visions that kind of shaped globalization, not as a process that is unfolding beyond anybody's particular control on its own, but as a telos, as a clear kind of trajectory of where the world is going. At the moment, the picture looks messy. So on one hand, we have populism and insular nationalism in a lot of countries that want their state to focus on responsibilities for only their citizens. Don't accept migrants, do not provide foreign aid, do not advance international law and responsibilities anymore, regain control, regain our borders, while at the same time wanting to reap the benefits of global production lines. For example, Donald Trump announced tariffs and then a couple of days later said, well, actually, iPhones and tablets coming from China will be exempt from it, right? So then you realize the economic balance of global production, and the contention that comes with insular politics and nationalism is creating this inconsistency. So globalization still contains with itself a lot of benefits, even for its skeptics, but also puts a lot of social and domestic pressure on policymakers, both internally and externally. So if you're a policymaker within this kind of fragmented global context, you are facing a domestic politic that is really concerned about their own issues. They don't want you to distribute resources or be partake in global development as much as perhaps 20, 30 years ago, if you were a European or North American states, that thinking about global issues, they don't want you to provide aid, they don't want you to support NGOs or charities, or they don't want to talk about UN, they don't want to talk about International Trade Organization and EU and European courts and ICC and ICJ. They want you to basically focus on their own roads, their own welfare domestically. So you have that pressure on one hand. But you also still have all these treaties, legal obligations, contractual obligations of decades and decades of integration in the global economy that shapes you, that still shapes your opportunities and possibilities, no matter how bold you might feel and how strong of a domestic political mandate you have limitations. You have obligations, and there would be clear outcomes of the policy decisions that basically you take. So when you think about global public policy today, analysis becomes a lot more difficult than any clear-cut theoretical approach. And you will find a lot of these typologies of the West versus global South, those winners versus losers, and a geographic understanding of it, or the first world or the third world kind of language that is of a yester era, are actually not helpful. So if you are from a liberal approach in theoretical terms, not in social political perspectives, but if your theoretical orientation is more from a liberal theory perspective, where you see global institutions as regulating, providing a language, and shaping local actors and having an effect, as much as local actors have an effect on those institutions, there's a lot of merit in that thinking. There's also a lot of merit to think about a more kind of left-leaning or neo-Marxist even approach to look at global production and what it creates in workforce imbalances and bourgeois and this class structure that is quite alive, and identities that come with belonging to countries with higher production or better economic opportunities versus not, and displacement in the world. But even that still falls short on the complexity of distribution of wealth, presence of global companies, global interest groups, global NGOs, global charities that are not necessarily shaped by that, and are working against it, not from a perspective of traditional classification of working class versus the boss class, but actually those class structures are a lot more complex in today's world, depending upon where you are. So how do you develop a policy to solve issues like climate change that doesn't really know any boundary, terrorism, instability, misinformation, disinformation, and its effect on relations between different genders, women's rights, vulnerabilities experienced by individuals from LGBTQI communities or ethnic minorities or religious minorities, that all cuts across different class and economic directions, cuts across global regulations, but poses serious policy pressures on particular local governments or puts global pressures on them to act in a certain way and pursue particular policies. So when you develop a global public policy analysis perspective, you're thinking about multiple layers, both drawing from traditional policy layers that we discussed, right? Remember the four stages, like which was the problem definition and agenda setting. Stage two is formal decision making. Stage three is policy implementation. Stage four is monitoring and evaluation. Those four key traditional components of a local policy, even a global policy established by a global entity like the World Trade Organization, etc., still the same. But the factors shaping those and the questions that we ask and the characteristics that we observe are no longer just one layer or one particular domestic pressure. New technologies, global developments like COVID-19 cut across so many of these boundaries and puts pressures on all of these kind of issues, making cooperation both a necessity that is inevitable in a global context, but also with increased populism and increased insular nationalism across the world, a very difficult case to make. So while you're doing your readings for this session, you're going to be exposed to some of these debates. Has globalization ended? Is this the end of globalism? Well, I am not sure. And you will see that talk from the World Economic Forum presentation and discussion that challenges some of that thinking. that actually globalization is a lot more fragmented, a lot more messy. But what is definitely broken is this clear trajectory of a world that was getting ever so close, ever so wealthy, ever so peaceful. We are now facing a historic level of displacement coming out of wars and refugees and conflicts. The things which we thought were left behind us are not. So developing a local policy within a global context of economic uncertainty, increased wars again and displacement, climate change, possibility of pandemics affecting us around the world, again, thanks to globalization process itself with transportation, are ever so real concerns. So how are we going to conceptualize local policies within a global context and all the inconsistencies, fragmentation of the current international structures and law and regulations, in the era of Donald Trump, but even before him, even under Obama, even under Joe Biden, it was a similar approach coming from US governments, EU, pursuing regulation as a supranational structure on a particular continent, still focusing on it, but kind of also let go of a lot of its early or last 20, 30 years long focus of ever so coming closer, centralized power, national interests within European Union still shape both EU's own regulations for everybody, but also how it's affected or implemented locally. And then obviously other states like China as a major power that wants to shape a global regulation structure that reflects its own interests. But they're also shaped by it. US is shaped by the global regulations, China is shaped by it, EU is shaped by it, and EU member states that make EU possible are also shaped in this process together. So that's why global public analysis and thinking about global public policy is an intersection of international relations, comparative politics, economics, and traditional kind of policy and governance. And you will be exploring this in this session and the kind of theoretical questions that we're still trying to wrestle with. And hopefully, in your weekly readings and in the forum, you will highlight some of the points that you are exploring or some of the perspectives you might have because of your own personal experiences.